You have a day off, not a modern day off. Not the kind where you sleep until 9, make coffee with a machine that does most of the work, scroll through your phone for 20 minutes before you've fully committed to being awake, and then spend the morning deciding whether to go to the gym or watch something on a streaming service that contains more content than every library in medieval Europe combined. A medieval day off, which is to say, not really a day off at all, because the medieval world did not have days off in the modern sense, and the question of what medieval people did all day is considerably more interesting and considerably more exhausting than the popular imagination tends to assume. The popular imagination, when it thinks about medieval daily life, tends toward one of two equally wrong pictures. The first is the romantic version, the sun-dappled village, the cheerful peasants tending their gardens, the knights practicing their swordsmanship in the castle courtyard, the monks illuminating manuscripts in peaceful scriptoria, everyone living a simpler, slower life that the modern world has lost touch with. The second is the grimly dismissive version. Everyone was miserable, everything was filthy, life was nasty, brutish and short, and the medieval person's day was an undifferentiated slog of poverty and toil punctuated by disease and early death. Both of these pictures are wrong, and both of them are wrong in the same fundamental way. They fail to treat medieval people, as individuals with the full human range of motivations, pleasures, frustrations, relationships, boredom, ambition, humor, and the specific daily texture of a life being lived rather than merely endured. What did medieval people actually do all day? They worked, yes, they worked hard, in many cases harder than any modern equivalent, but they also gossiped. They argued about politics and theology, and whether their neighbor's pig had destroyed their cabbages, and who was responsible. They fell in love, impractically, and at inconvenient moments. They played games. They drank ale, in quantities that the modern public health establishment would find concerning. They complained about the weather, about their landlords, about the price of grain, about the behavior of young people, which was apparently always disappointing regardless of the century. They told jokes, some of which survive, and are genuinely funny. They worried about money and status and the future, and whether God approved of their choices, which is an anxiety that has not diminished perceptibly in the intervening centuries. This script is organized around a single day, a summer day in the 13th or 14th century in a prosperous English village. And it follows 3 people through that day: a peasant farmer, a blacksmith's wife, and the Lord's steward. Not because these 3 people were the only people in medieval England, but because they represent 3 different layers of the social structure that existed in every medieval community, and the differences between their days illuminate the texture of medieval life more completely than any single perspective could. The day begins before sunrise. It always does. Chapter 1. Before dawn, the hour nobody talks about and everybody experienced. It is approximately 4 in the morning. There is no clock. The concept of 4 in the morning as a specific named moment, a point on a numbered scale of hours that runs from midnight to midnight, is not quite how the medieval person organizes their experience of time. What they have instead is the quality of the darkness, the specific character of the pre-dawn hour that the body learns to recognize after enough mornings of waking in it, the deep quiet that precedes the first bird, the particular coldness that arrives in the hour before the sky begins to lighten, the sense that the night has finished its deepest business and is beginning, very slowly, to let go. Thomas, our peasant farmer, a villain holding approximately 15 acres of strip field in the open field system of his manor, wakes in this darkness. Not because an alarm has sounded, because his body has been waking at this hour for 38 years, because the agricultural rhythms of his life have entrained his sleep patterns to the requirements of the land, and because the biological clock that the modern person tries to override with blackout curtains and sleep tracking apps is, in Thomas, operating exactly as it evolved to operate, responding to the light, to the temperature, to the accumulated experience of a life organized around the hours of daylight available in the English summer. He does not spring up. The 2-sleep pattern the pre-industrial habit of sleeping in 2 segments with a waking interval in the middle of the night, means that Thomas has already been awake once, briefly around midnight, said a prayer, exchanged a few quiet words with his wife, and gone back to sleep. This second waking is different from the midnight interval. It is the waking that leads to rising, the body already beginning its transition from the resting state to the working one. The first thing he does, before he is fully on his feet, is assess the fire. The fire in the central hearth has been banked since last night, the ash covering that has kept the coals alive through the sleeping hours. And the specific quality of the warmth in the room tells him, before he looks, whether the coals have held. They have. He uncovers them, adds the kindling that was placed beside the hearth last night specifically for this morning, and watches the fire climb back to its working height. This takes perhaps 5 minutes and requires no conscious decision-making. It is as automatic as the modern person's first reach for the coffee machine, and it serves the same function of bridging the gap between sleep and full wakefulness. His wife Alice is already moving. This is worth noting, because the popular image of the medieval peasant as a solitary figure trudging through a cold dawn is an image that systematically erases the women who were up before the men in most households, whose first light work had been running for half an hour before the men's first light work began. Alice is feeding the fire properly now that it's established, setting the pot of yesterday's pottage back over the heat to warm for the morning meal, and beginning the organization of the morning's dairy work, the milking that needs to happen before any other animal-related task, because the cow that hasn't been milked is a cow that is uncomfortable and letting you know about it. The cow is making its position clear. Thomas pulls on his brays, the linen underpants that are the medieval man's base layer, and over them the woolen hose, the tunic, the leather belt. His feet go into the leather shoes that are by the door, resoled twice already, and resolable perhaps once more, before the upper gives out entirely, at which point there will be a conversation with the cobbler about credit and a period of making do that Thomas is not currently enthusiastic about thinking about. The whole process of dressing takes perhaps 3 minutes, because there are no buttons, laces, and toggles, which the hands manage without needing the eyes, which means dressing in the dark is not the challenge it would be with a modern shirt. The children, there are 4, aged 6 to 14, are beginning to stir. The 14-year-old John is already up. John's relationship with the pre-dawn rising is more complicated than his father's. He has not yet lived the decades that train the body into cheerful compliance with agricultural time. But he is up because the alternative is a specific look from Alice that both parents deploy with the efficiency of people who have children and limited patience for renegotiating the morning's work. Allocation. The morning meal happens now, while the light is still dim, and the fire is the room's primary light source. The pottage, thick, grain-based, with whatever vegetables and scraps went into the pot last night, is ladled into the wooden bowls that Alice has set on the table. Bread from yesterday. Ale, because water is uncertain, and ale, even the weak table ale of the everyday household, is reliable. The meal takes perhaps 15 minutes, eaten standing or sitting on the bench with the efficient purposefulness of people who have a lot to do and know it. This is the first thing that medieval people did all day. They ate the first meal in the dark, standing up out of wooden bowls before the sun was fully up. Not because they were primitive or impoverished, but because the day's work was organized around the available light. And the available light in a northern European summer started at approximately 4:30 in the morning, and the work needed to start with it. Meanwhile, in the manor house at the north end of the village, Robert the steward is engaged in a different kind of pre-dawn activity. Robert is not a peasant. He is a skilled administrative professional, the Lord's representative in the management of the estate. A man of genuine importance in the village hierarchy, who can read and write Latin as well as English, and who keeps the accounts of the manor in a hand that his employer has described as creditable. Robert is also, at 4 in the morning, doing something that the peasant Thomas is not, worrying. The accounts for the quarter are due to the Lord's auditor next week, And Robert has a discrepancy in the grain records that he cannot resolve. 17 bushels of rye that the reeve recorded as harvested last autumn, but that the tithe barn inventory doesn't confirm. 17 bushels of rye is not, in the abstract, a crisis. In the specific context of a Lord's auditor who is looking for evidence of either incompetence or dishonesty, 17 bushels of rye is the kind of discrepancy that becomes a much larger problem if it can't be explained by the time the auditor arrives. Robert has been awake since 2. He got up at 3 and lit his own candle. Tallow, not beeswax, because even a steward's household uses tallow for everyday work. And has been going through the accounts by candlelight, his finger tracing the columns of figures, his lips moving slightly as he works through the arithmetic that might reveal where the 17 bushels went. The arithmetic is the arithmetic of Roman numerals, which is actually harder to do computationally than the Arabic numerals that won't become standard in English administrative documents for another century or two, which is a problem that Robert doesn't know he has because he has never worked with any other system. His wife Margaret is asleep. Margaret will not be asleep much longer. Her morning is also organized around dairy work and the management of the household that is significantly more complex than Thomas's, because the steward's household includes 2 servants whose work needs to be organized, a pantry whose contents need to be managed, and the social dimension of being the most important woman in the village below the lady of the manor, which requires that the steward's house present itself at a standard that the peasant's longhouse doesn't have to meet. The blacksmith's wife Eleanor is also awake. Eleanor is awake because her husband William gets up at 4 to light the forge, and the forge lighting is a process that involves noise, the specific clanging and muttering that a man cursing a reluctant fire produces in the pre-dawn quiet, that Eleanor has learned to sleep through in theory, but doesn't always manage in practice. She lies in the warmth of the bed for another 20 minutes, which is her luxury, and then she is up, because the day doesn't wait for people who lie in bed reasoning that they could, in theory, stay there longer. 3 people, 3 households, 3 different versions of the pre-dawn hour, all of them awake before the sun, all of them already working in one form or another, before the light that most modern people consider the absolute minimum baseline for beginning to think about possibly getting up. This is the first answer to the question of what medieval people did all day. They started earlier than you think, in the dark, doing things that needed to be done before the light arrived to allow the doing of things that required light. The sun is coming up. The day is beginning in earnest. Chapter 2. The morning, the work that didn't stop, and the work that looked like something else. The light arrives gradually in the English summer, the gray pre-dawn thickening slowly into the pale gold of the early morning, and by the time it is fully light, perhaps 5 o'clock, perhaps 5:30, the village is already operational in ways that suggest it has been operational for some time. Thomas is in his strips. The open field system of the medieval English village, the organization of the arable land into 2 or 3 large fields, each field divided into narrow strips that were allocated to individual households, with the strips of different households interleaved rather than consolidated, is the agricultural framework within which Thomas's entire working life is organized, and understanding it is essential to understanding what he actually does all day. His 15 acres are not 15 acres in one place. They are scattered across the village's 3 fields in strips of approximately half an acre each, 30 strips in total, distributed through the north field, the south field, and the west field, each strip separated from its neighbors by the low ridges of earth that demarcate the individual holdings. This distribution was not accidental or irrational. It was the result of a system that deliberately mixed good and poor soil across the holdings of different villagers, ensuring that no single holder had all the best land and no single holder had all the worst. The practical consequence is that Thomas spends a significant part of every working day walking between his strips, the north field strip where the spring rye is looking well, the south field strip where there is a drainage problem he's been meaning to address, the Westfield strip where the peas are coming in and need watching for the specific pest that took half the crop 2 years ago, and whose return he does not intend to enable. His working day is not the management of a single unified farm. It is the management of 30 separate pieces of land, distributed across an area of perhaps 400 acres, with the specific logistical challenges that this distribution creates. This morning, in high summer, Thomas is haymaking. The Lord's meadow has been cut first. The labor services that Thomas owes to the manor include haymaking, and the Lord's hay comes before the village hay, which is the specific economic logic of the manorial system expressing itself in the form of 2 weeks of Thomas's summer being committed to someone else's land before he can attend to his own. The hay that Thomas is turning this morning, the cut grass that needs to be moved and aerated so it can dry before it can be stored, is the Lord's hay, and he is turning it with a wooden-handled fork that he made himself last winter from the ash tree he has the right to coppice in the Lord's woodland. The work is physical, continuous, and skilled in ways that the description, turning hay, doesn't capture. The skill of haymaking is the skill of reading the drying conditions, the humidity, the temperature, the wind, and knowing how much turning is needed, when the hay is ready to be gathered into cocks, when the cocks are dry enough to be moved to the tithe barn, when a change in the weather requires urgent action. 2. Protect hay that isn't dry yet from the rain that will ruin it. Thomas has 38 years of English summer weather in his assessment of the sky this morning, and what he sees tells him that the weather will hold for another 2 days, but that the third day looks uncertain, which means the pacing of the haymaking has a deadline that the pleasant temperature of the current morning doesn't suggest. He is not alone in the meadow. The other villagers who owe haymaking service to the Lord are there too. A dozen men and women working the same field, their tools moving in the rhythm of people who have done this work together before, who know each other's pace and each other's habits, who are simultaneously doing hard physical labor and conducting the ongoing social life of a community that spends most of its working time inside of each other. The talk is the thing that the accounts of medieval peasant labor consistently underreport, and that would have been the most immediately striking feature of the working day to anyone who stepped into it. The haymaking, the plowing, the harvest, these were communal activities, and communal activities were occasions for the social interaction that the medieval village ran on. The gossip, the news, the complaints, the jokes, the ongoing negotiations of a community whose members were in close, continuous relationship with each other. All of this happened in the field, alongside the work, in the way that office conversation happens alongside office work. The specific topics of this morning's conversation in the Lord's meadow: the marriage of the miller's eldest daughter, which everyone agrees is both good for the miller and suspicious in terms of the speed with which it was arranged. The state of the Northfield drainage, which is always a topic in wet years, and which this year has produced an argument between two of the strip's holders about whose responsibility the blocked ditch actually is. The rumor that the Lord is planning to increase the labor services required of the villains next season, which is greeted with the specific muttering displeasure of people who do not have the power to refuse, but intend to make their displeasure clearly felt through every legal and social mechanism available. This is what medieval people did while they worked. They talked. They talked about the same things that people in every era talk about: relationships and money and grievances and local politics and the behavior of people they knew and the prospects for the season. The medieval peasant working in the field was not a silent, solitary figure. They were a social animal doing social work in a social environment, and the work was the framework within which the social life happened, rather than the enemy of it. Alice, meanwhile, is doing something that medieval sources call housework, and that modern analysis recognizes as a second full-time job conducted simultaneously with the first. The morning's dairy work, the milking completed before Thomas left, the milk set in the shallow pans in the coolest corner of the house for the cream to rise, is the beginning of a morning that also includes the bread that needs to be made today, because yesterday's is finished, the garden that needs weeding, because it always needs weeding, the spinning that needs to happen, because the household's textile needs are continuous, and wool doesn't spin itself, and the management of the children who are old enough to be assigned tasks and young enough to require supervision while performing them. The bread making deserves specific attention because it represents the kind of skill that medieval women were expected to possess, that they developed through years of practice, and that produced results that, according to the accounts of people who have reconstructed medieval bread recipes, were genuinely good. The maslin flour of the ordinary household, a mixture of rye and wheat, with the proportions varying by what the harvest had produced and what the household could afford, was mixed with water from the well, yeast from the ale, brewing that happened regularly in most households, and salt, and kneaded for long enough that the gluten developed properly. The dough rose by the fire. It was baked in the communal oven if the household had access to one, or in the clay oven that better provisioned households maintained, or in a pot set in the coals. The communal oven was one of the village's shared infrastructure, typically owned by the lord and used by the villagers for a fee. The oven fee was another of the small, continuous extractions of the manorial system, and its use required coordination among the households who all needed to bake on the same day. The organization of the communal oven's use was part of the social management of the village that happened informally, through the conversation of the women who were all making bread on the same morning, and who needed to coordinate who got the oven first without the benefit of a scheduling app. Eleanor, the blacksmith's wife, has a slightly different morning. The blacksmith's household is a trade household rather than a purely agricultural one. William earns his living through his craft rather than through his strips, which means the household's economic organization is different from Thomas's, in ways that give Eleanor more flexibility in some respects and less in others. She doesn't have strips to manage. She does have the accounts of the smithy to keep, the supplies of iron and charcoal to monitor, the customers who come to pay for work completed, and the new customers who come to commission new work, all of which passes through Eleanor's organizational management because William's attention is on the forge and someone's attention needs to be on everything else. The smithy's books, a mental accounting rather than a written one, because Eleanor's literacy is functional rather than extensive, include the knowledge that 3 farmers owe payment for plowshare repairs completed last month, that the Lord's estate owes for the ironwork done on the new gate, and that the charcoal supply needs to be replenished before the end of the week if William is going to complete the commission for the church's new door hinges that the priest has been asking about since Michaelmas. Eleanor carries this information the way a modern business owner carries the knowledge of their receivables and payables, continuously, as background awareness that surfaces when the relevant parties appear. The morning also involves the kitchen garden, which is Eleanor's domain, and which produces the herbs, vegetables, and fruit that supplement the household's purchased food supplies. The kitchen garden of a prosperous trade household was a genuine food production system. Not a decorative garden in the modern sense, but a productive one, organized for maximum yield from the available space, maintained with the practical attention of someone who knows exactly what contribution each plant makes to the household's food budget. Robert the steward's morning is organized around paper, or rather parchment, because paper is still relatively uncommon in 13th century England, and the specific anxiety of the 17 missing bushels. By full daylight, he has found the discrepancy's source. The Reeves record was made before a portion of the rye was diverted to seed corn for the spring planting, and the seed corn wasn't recorded separately in the inventory because the Reeve, who is a conscientious man but not a systematic one, assumed Robert knew about it. Robert did not know about it. Robert now knows about it, and the specific relief of an accountant who has found the missing entry is one of those pleasures that requires no translation across the centuries. Robert's morning will continue with the inspection of the Eastfield drainage work that was supposed to have been completed last week, the meeting with the Reeve about next month's labor service requirements, the letter that needs to be drafted to the Lord about the condition of the mill. The millstone is cracked and needs replacement before the autumn harvest, and the replacement needs to be authorized and funded, which means a letter, which means Robert's literacy is earning its keep this morning. 3 mornings, 3 completely different kinds of work, all beginning in the dark, and all running at full capacity before the rest of the world is properly awake. But the morning is only the beginning. The midday brings its own specific character. Chapter 3. Midday. The meal, the rest, and the business. Of being a community, it is approximately noon. The church bell sounds from the village church, the bell of the canonical hour of sext, the 6th hour, which marks the midpoint of the daylight, and which the villagers use as the midday signal with the reliability of a clock. The bell is not optional, and it is not primarily a time signal. It is a call to prayer, the reminder that the canonical hours structure the day as a series of moments of communion with the divine. The medieval day was, in its formal structure, a day organized around prayer, and the actual use of the prayer signals as time markers was the practical layering of utility over theology that the medieval mind managed with considerable unself-consciousness. Thomas comes in from the meadow. The midday meal is the main meal of the day, the substantial meal that the morning's physical labor has created a genuine appetite for, that will fuel the afternoon's work, and that is consumed with the seriousness that serious hunger produces. The pottage that has been cooking since morning is now ready, thicker than the morning's version, the ingredients having cooked down to the dense, caloric stew that the medieval cook knew how to produce from whatever the household and the season provided. There is bread, there is ale, if it is not a fast day, and today it is not, there is a piece of salt pork, or perhaps a few eggs from the chickens that have been producing well this month, or the cheese that Alice made from the morning's cream. The meal is eaten at the table, sitting down, which marks it as the important meal, rather than the functional ones on either side of it. The family gathers: Thomas, Alice, the children, possibly John, who has been helping with his own tasks in the garden. The conversation continues the social life of the household, the state of the hay, the neighbor's drainage dispute that Thomas heard more about this morning, the question of whether the youngest child's cough is serious enough to warrant a visit to the village healer, or whether it will resolve on its own. After the meal, rest, the midday rest, the siesta, the post-meal break, that is not a medieval peculiarity, but a human physiological response to the combination of a large meal, physical exhaustion, and the hottest part of the summer day. Was a standard feature of the medieval agricultural day, recognized in the organization of the working schedule, and defended by workers who understood that attempting to do heavy physical labor in the midday heat after a substantial meal was neither productive nor comfortable. The lords who tried to eliminate or reduce the midday rest found that their labor services were less productive as a result. Thomas lies on the bench near the door, where the air moves and the shade keeps the temperature bearable, and he is asleep within minutes, the specific, efficient sleep of someone who woke before dawn and has been doing hard physical work for 6 hours. This nap lasts perhaps an hour, perhaps an hour and a half. It is not laziness. It is the biological reality of a body managing its energy through a working day that starts before dawn and ends after dusk, using rest as a resource rather than a luxury. Alice does not nap. Alice is doing the spinning. The spinning is the work that happened in every available moment of the medieval woman's day. The drop spindle that could be worked while watching the children, while walking to the well, while sitting in the midday shade, while doing other tasks that left one hand free. The textile needs of the medieval household were continuous and enormous. The clothing, the bedding, the household linens, and the production of the yarn from which the weaving was done was the work that filled the gaps between all the other work. This is the hidden labor of the medieval day that the accounts of agricultural work consistently undercount. The spinning, the weaving, the sewing, the mending, the washing, the childcare, the dairy work, the garden management, the food processing and preservation, all the work that kept the household functioning and that was performed primarily by women, and that was treated by the medieval administrative and literary tradition that recorded the era as the invisible background to the visible work of the fields. It was not invisible to the people doing it. It was simply work, in the same category as all the other work, requiring the same skill and producing the same results. Alice's spinning produced the yarn that, when woven and cut and sewn, would be the tunic her youngest would need before winter. The economic value of this production was real and measurable. the yarn and cloth it produced were market goods with market prices, even though the accounting systems of the period didn't record it the same way they recorded the grain harvest. The midday in the village is also, in summer, the busiest period for a specific kind of activity that the agricultural schedule creates: the buying and selling of small goods that doesn't require a market day. The woman who has too many eggs this week trades them with the woman who has too much milk. The man who has finished a tool repair trades the work for a favor that will be called in when needed. The informal economy of the medieval village, the continuous, small-scale exchange of goods and labor and favors that operated alongside the formal cash and market economy, was conducted in the midday hours when people were moving around the village between the morning's work and the afternoons, when the chance encounter at the well or the road was the occasion for the transaction that had been pending. Robert the steward doesn't have a midday rest. Robert has a meeting. The reeve, the peasant representative, who managed the day-to-day agricultural operation of the manor's domain land, is waiting at the manor house at noon, and the meeting between the steward and the reeve is one of the regular administrative encounters that kept the manor's operations coordinated. The reeve is a man named Hugh, elected by the village to the position, and Hugh's relationship with Robert is the relationship of two men who are technically on opposite sides of the manorial divide. Hugh represents the villagers' interests to the administration. Robert represents the administration's interests to the villagers, but who have worked together for long enough to have developed the specific mutual respect of people who deal with the same problems from different angles, and who find that the other's angle is sometimes more useful than their own. The meeting covers several items. The east field drainage. The work is behind schedule because the villager who was supposed to do it this week had his ox go lame, and the ox laming is a genuine emergency in the agricultural calendar that requires everyone to prioritize helping the affected household before the manor's drainage project. Robert, who has been thinking about the auditor's visit, finds this more irritating than he would normally. Hugh, who has been thinking about the villager whose ox went lame, finds Robert's irritation more irritating than he would normally. This kind of negotiation, the ongoing, somewhat tense, always necessary negotiation between the manorial administration and the village community, was one of the defining features of medieval rural life, and it happened every day, in every village, between every steward and every reeve, with the specific texture of two people who need each other and know it, and find the need occasionally annoying. After the meeting with Hugh, Robert has his midday meal, a meal that is more elaborate than Thomas's in its variety, but not dramatically so in its basic structure: pottage, bread, ale, some salted fish, because Margaret has organized the household's provisions with the careful attention of a woman who knows what they can afford and what they cannot. Robert eats at the table with Margaret and their two children, and the conversation is about the letter to the Lord, which Margaret will help Robert draft, because her Latin is actually slightly better than his, and he has learned to use this advantage without making it too obvious that he is using it. Eleanor's midday is organized around the smithy's social life, which is considerable. The smithy is one of the village's social centers, the place where people come to have work done, to wait while it's being done, and to talk while they're waiting. The conversation that surrounds the forge is the village's daily news service. The smithy is one of the nodes through which information circulates, and Eleanor, who manages the social dimension of the smithy, while William manages the metallurgical one, is one of the village's most informed people. She knows by noon that the miller's daughter's marriage is more complicated than it appeared because the miller's wife is not speaking to the daughter's new mother-in-law. She knows that the Lord's auditor is expected next week, which she knows before Robert does, because the auditor's travel arrangements produced inquiries to the Lord's cook about accommodation, which produced a conversation between the cook and the miller's wife, which produced the information arriving at the smithy before it arrived at the manor house. She knows that the drainage dispute in the North Field is going to go to the manor court, which will be expensive for both parties and entertaining for everyone else. This is the midday intelligence service of the medieval village, conducted over the forge's heat, and Eleanor is one of its most efficient operators. Chapter 4. The Afternoon. The long stretch and the work that waited the afternoon in a medieval summer day is long, very long. The sun doesn't set until 9, or later in a northern European summer, and the working day extends with it. Not at the same intensity as the morning, because the midday rest was specifically designed to create the energy reserve for the afternoon, but continuously, the work flowing from the rest back into the afternoon without a sharp transition. The medieval working day was not 9 to 5. It was dawn to dusk, with the midday rest as the hinge in the middle, and in summer the dusk was very far away. Thomas is back in the meadow. The afternoon haymaking has a different character from the mornings. The dew that made the morning grass slightly damp has burned off entirely, and the hay that was turned this morning is drying well in the afternoon sun. Better than Thomas expected, which means the third day's window might be more generous than the morning sky suggested. This is the kind of small, specific agricultural satisfaction that the farming life produces constantly. The assessment made in the morning, confirmed or confounded by the afternoon's evidence, the ongoing negotiation between expectation and outcome that is the farmer's primary intellectual activity. The afternoon also brings the specific work of the strips that belong to Thomas. Not the Lord's hay, but his own crops, which need attention that the morning's labor service didn't allow. The peas in the west field are ready for picking, or nearly ready a day or two more. And the timing of the harvest is a judgment call that experience makes, but that still requires the specific attention of walking to the strip and looking at the plants and making the assessment that determines whether the picking starts tomorrow or the day after. The weeding, the perpetual necessary, never completed weeding of the medieval field. The strips were planted by broadcasting, scattering the seed across the prepared ground, rather than in rows, which meant that weeding couldn't be done mechanically, with a hoe between rows, but had to be done by hand, plant by plant, walking through the field and pulling the thistle and the dock and the couch grass that established themselves with the patient persistence of organisms that have been doing this longer than agriculture has been trying to stop them. Children did much of the weeding. The 6-year-old who was old enough to distinguish a weed from a crop, but not yet old enough for the heavier field work, was the specific age category for which weeding was designed, and the village fields in summer afternoons were full of children doing this work, their small figures moving through the crops in a way that the adult's body couldn't manage without damaging the plants. This is not child exploitation in the modern sense. It is the integration of children into the household's productive activity that every pre-industrial agricultural society practiced, and that the children understood as their contribution to the family's survival, rather than as an imposition. The children who were weeding the strips this afternoon were also, incidentally, doing something else, playing, not instead of working, alongside it in the way that the task of moving slowly through a field, pulling weeds allowed for the conversation, the small games, the social interaction of children who spend their working time in each other's company. The medieval child's life was not divided between work and play, the way that modern childhood is structured, but the play that happened within and around the work was real play, with the specific creativity and humor and occasional cruelty of children in any era. Alice's afternoon is organized around the garden, the dairy, the children, and the spinning, in a rotation determined by which task is most urgent at any given moment. The garden weeding, the kitchen garden is also always in need of weeding, is the afternoon's physical component, the work that gets the body moving after the midday's relative rest. The dairy work of the afternoon, checking the cream pans, beginning the churning that will take the cream to butter, managing the milk that has reached the point where it's ready to be turned to cheese, is the skilled work that requires attention rather than heavy labor. The churning of butter is one of those medieval tasks that is both simple in description. You put the cream in a container and agitate it repeatedly until the fat globules aggregate, and tedious in execution, the repetitive motion required to bring the cream to the butter stage, taking longer than seems reasonable every single time. Alice churns while standing near the door, where she can watch the children in the garden and the road to the village for anything that requires attention. The specific multitasking of the woman who is always responsible for several things simultaneously. The spinning continues through every available moment of the afternoon. The drop spindle picked up when the hands are free, set down when they're needed for something else. Picked up again. The continuity of the spinning through the day, the way it occupied the hands during conversations, during rest, during the watching of children, was so fundamental to medieval women's experience that the spindle became the symbol of femininity in the period's art and literature. Not because spinning was the only thing women did, but because the spindle was rarely not present. Robert's afternoon is in the East Field. The drainage inspection that was supposed to happen in the morning got pushed to the afternoon by the meeting with Hugh, and Robert is now walking the East Field's drainage ditches with the specific attention of a man who needs to have an accurate picture of the situation before the auditor arrives. The East Field drainage is, by Robert's assessment, about 3/4 of the work needed. The section that's incomplete is the section that would have been done this week if the ox hadn't gone lame. The auditor is not going to be interested in the ox. Robert makes notes on his wax tablet, the erasable writing surface of the working administrator, the medieval equivalent of a notepad, which can be written on with a stylus and erased by warming the wax as he walks the ditch line. The notes are in a mixture of Latin and English that reflects the bilingual nature of medieval administrative literacy. Latin for the formal terms, English for the specific, local details that don't have convenient Latin equivalents. The afternoon also includes a stop at the mill. The millstone situation is urgent enough that Robert wants to see it directly, rather than relying on the miller's account, which he will need to confirm in his letter to the Lord. The mill is at the edge of the village, where the stream provides the water power for the mill wheel. And the miller, a man of considerably more social and economic complexity than his occupation suggests, is expecting Robert's visit with the specific combination of resentment and respect that the miller always brings to interactions with the manor's administration. The miller is resentful because the manor takes a cut of every bushel ground at the mill, because the miller's monopoly on grinding is enforced by manorial authority that the villagers often circumvent by using hand querns at home when they think they can get away with it, and because the inspection of the millstone is the administration's way of verifying what the miller has told them, which implies that the administration doesn't entirely trust the miller's account, which the miller finds professionally insulting, even though the administration's general position on trusting the miller's account is not without some foundation. The millstone is cracked. Robert sees it, notes it, discusses with the miller the timeline for replacement and the cost, and adds this to the mental list of items for the letter to the Lord. The crack is not yet dangerous. The stone can continue working for a few more weeks, but by the harvest it needs to be replaced, because the harvest is when every bushel of grain in the village needs to be ground, and the mill cannot afford to be out of service. Eleanor's afternoon brings the smithy's most interesting customer of the day, the Lord's bailiff, collecting overdue rents from the village households, who stops at the smithy to discuss the commission for new locks on the manor house's storerooms. The bailiff is a man who occupies an uncomfortable social position. He is the Lord's agent for the least popular of the Lord's functions, the extraction of payments from people who often can't easily afford them. And his relationship with the village is accordingly complicated. Eleanor manages this relationship with considerable skill. She is polite to the bailiff because the Lord's business is important to the smithy, and she extracts from the conversation the information she actually wants: how much the storeroom commission is worth, what the timeline is, whether payment will be prompt or will join the growing list of the Lord's estate's overdue accounts. She also learns, in the course of the conversation, that the Lord is coming to the village next month for the court sessions, which is information that the entire village will want to have, because the court sessions are one of the most significant events of the village year. The Lord's Court, the manorial court that met several times a year to handle the legal business of the manor, from land transfers to disputes to the enforcement of manorial obligations, was the formal institution through which the village's conflicts were resolved, its land transactions recorded, and its social order enforced. The announcement of the court session's date was significant news that would travel around the village by tomorrow morning, changing plans and reviving anxieties in the households that had pending matters to settle. Eleanor will mention the court date to the next 3 people who come to the smithy, and by evening it will be known throughout the village. This is the medieval village news distribution system at work, and it runs entirely on conversation. Chapter 5. The Late Afternoon. The Last Light, and the work that owned it. The sun is lower now, not setting. It won't set for several hours yet, and the specific quality of the late afternoon light in an English summer, the warmth of it turning from white to gold, and the shadows lengthening without the urgency of actual dusk, is the light that the medieval working day used for its most precise tasks. The morning's light was for the heavy work, the haymaking, the field work, the physical labor that required energy more than visibility. The afternoon's later hours produced a light that was both excellent for fine work and accompanied by the temperature drop that made the remaining tasks more comfortable than the midday heat had made them. Thomas is repairing a fence. This sounds mundane. It is mundane. And it is representative of something important about the medieval agricultural day that the romantic account of peasant life consistently misses. The enormous proportion of the working year that was devoted not to the dramatic acts of plowing and harvesting and haymaking, but to the maintenance work that kept the farm's infrastructure functioning. The fence that needed repair, the drainage ditch that needed clearing, the gate that had been hanging crooked since February, the tool handle that had cracked and needed replacement before the harvest, when it would be needed urgently. This was the constant background work of the agricultural life, the work that didn't have a season because every season produced its own version of it. The specific fence Thomas is repairing separates his garden from the common lane, and its failure matters practically. The village's livestock, driven along the lane to the common pasture, will find the gap and be in his garden within an hour of the fence, failing completely, and the damage a pig does to a kitchen garden in an hour is not modest. The repair is a matter of cutting and shaping new stakes from the hedgerow wood, driving them into the earth with a wooden mallet, and weaving the cut brush between them in the way that Thomas learned from his father and that his father learned from his, the specific technique of hedge and fence work being one of the accumulated manual knowledges of the agricultural tradition. He works steadily, not quickly, with the pace of someone who knows how much daylight remains and how much work the job requires, and has calibrated the one against the other without needing to make the calculation consciously. This is one of the skills of the pre-clock agricultural life that the modern mind finds genuinely hard to replicate. The ability to pace work through a day organized, not by numbered hours, but by the quality and position of the light, by the physical state of the body, and by the accumulated experience of having done this work in this light many times before. His son John is with him, learning the fence repair the same way Thomas learned it, by watching and then by doing the simpler parts, while the experienced hand does the more critical ones. The transmission of agricultural knowledge was personal and direct in the medieval world, happening through exactly this kind of working apprenticeship. Father and son, mother and daughter, the knowledge moving between generations, not through written instruction, but through the shared experience of the work itself. John will know how to repair this fence because he is here now, with his hands on the stakes, watching what his father's hands do, and doing what his own hands can manage. This transmission of knowledge was one of the medieval community's most important activities, and it happened continuously, invisibly, in the course of the ordinary working day. The medieval agricultural community was a knowledge repository, the accumulated experience of generations of working the same land, in the same climate, with the same crops and the same livestock. And the maintenance of that repository depended on the continuous process of the older generation teaching the younger by example. Alice is making ale. The ale brewing of the medieval household was a regular skilled operation, typically conducted every week or 2 weeks, depending on the household's consumption and storage capacity. And it occupied a significant portion of Alice's afternoon. The process begins with the malted barley that Alice has prepared over the previous days. The barley that was soaked, allowed to partially germinate to convert its starches to fermentable sugars, and then dried in the kiln, which is now mashed with hot water in the large wooden vessel that sits in the corner of the house specifically for this purpose. The mashing extracts the sugars from the malt. The liquid produced, the wort, is drained off, cooled to the temperature that the yeast can work with, and pitched with the yeast that Alice keeps from the previous batch, the continuous culture that has been running in the household for years, and that has developed the specific character that Alice's ale is known for among the neighbors who sometimes buy a jug when their own supply runs short. The ale that results from this process within a day or two, because ale in the medieval period fermented quickly and was drunk young before it had the opportunity to develop the flavors that longer fermentation and storage would produce, was the household's primary beverage, the drink that went with every meal, that was offered to guests, that was sold when there was surplus. Alice's brewing skill was not a domestic hobby. It was a genuine economic contribution to the household. The ale she produced had market value, and the reputation she had established for the quality of her brewing was one of the household's assets as real as Thomas's strips. The alewife, the woman who brewed ale for sale in the medieval village, was one of the most important commercial figures in the village economy, and the transition from household brewing for domestic use to brewing for commercial sale was one that many women in Alice's position made when their brewing skill was sufficient and their household's situation made the additional income worthwhile. Alice is not quite at that point. The household's needs consume most of what she produces, but the possibility exists, and the knowledge that it exists is part of the economic picture she and Thomas maintain of their situation. Robert's late afternoon is organized around the letter. The letter to the Lord about the millstone has expanded in the process of composition to include the drainage issue, the labor service situation with the ox, the scheduling of the manor court, and a delicate reference to the question of whether the Lord intends to revise the labor service requirements next season, a question Robert frames in terms that leave the Lord maximum flexibility to decide that no revision is necessary without making it seem like Robert is advocating a position, because advocating positions is the Reeves function and Robert's function is to present information. The drafting of this letter is one of the aspects of Robert's work that most clearly distinguishes him from Thomas and Eleanor. The specific skill of written Latin composition, the ability to frame information in the formal register of administrative correspondence, the rhetorical management of a document that needs to communicate facts while also managing the reader's response to those facts. This is not a simple mechanical skill. It is a sophisticated communicative competence that the medieval administrative class developed through the grammar school education that Robert received as a boy, and that equipped him for exactly this kind of work. The letter is drafted on the wax tablet first, the erasable medium that allows revision without wasting parchment, and then transcribed to the parchment that will actually be sent. The parchment is expensive enough that Robert doesn't waste it on first drafts, and the process of revision on the wax tablet before committing to parchment is the medieval equivalent of the document draft that gets edited before being finalized. Margaret reads the draft. Her comments are specific. The paragraph about the drainage is too defensive in tone, implying that the delays are Robert's fault when they are the result of the ox situation, which is no one's fault. Robert revises. The paragraph about the millstone is clear and urgent without being alarmist. Robert leaves it. The paragraph about the labor services is, Margaret thinks, too subtle. The Lord will read it as a complaint rather than as information and respond defensively. Robert thinks about this for longer than the paragraph's length warrants, because this is the judgment call that matters most, and the one whose consequences are most significant if he gets it wrong. He revises the labor services paragraph 3 times. Eleanor's late afternoon brings the day's most technically demanding work. For not her own work, but the work she does in parallel with William's, holding and positioning the pieces he's forging when a second pair of hands is needed. The door hinges for the church are complex pieces, the strap hinges of the period, decorated at the tip with the specific leaf or scroll work that the priest has requested and that William has been planning since the commission arrived, the design sketched in charcoal on the flagstone floor of the smithy. Working alongside the forge is hot and loud and requires the specific coordination of two people who have worked together long enough to communicate without words. Eleanor knowing, from the angle of William's hammer, what he needs her to do next. William knowing, from the way Eleanor is holding the workpiece, whether his next strike will do what he intends. This is the physical language of the skilled craft partnership, and it is efficient in the way that only long practice produces. The door hinges are good work. William knows they're good. He has the craftsman's relationship with his own output, the ability to assess the work against the standard of what he intended to produce, and to feel the specific satisfaction when the two coincide. Eleanor knows they're good because she can see it, and because the priest's approval when he sees them will translate into payment that the household needs before the end of the month. The village is beginning its transition from the working afternoon to the early evening, and this transition happens not with a sharp boundary, but with a gradual reduction in the intensity of the outdoor work and a corresponding increase in the movement of people between households, toward the well, toward the green at the center of the village, where the day's last business and first socializing are beginning to overlap. Chapter 6. The Evening. What happened when the work finally wound down? The evening meal is the day's social event, not just for the family, for the extended community of the village, because in a world where the evening is organized around the fire, and the fire is where the family gathers, the boundary between household and community is more permeable than the modern home's closed door suggests. The neighbor who stops in during the evening meal and is offered a place at the table is not an intrusion. They are the continuation of the social life that the day's work began and that the evening extends. Thomas and Alice eat their evening meal with a neighbor, Walter, who has stopped in on his way back from the common pasture where he was checking on his sheep, and whose check revealed that one of the sheep has a leg injury that Thomas has seen before in his own flock and knows the treatment for. The treatment discussion is the pretext for the visit. The visit is the social reality. Both the treatment discussion and the social visit are genuine, and neither is pretense. Medieval rural social life operated on this double register, constantly, the practical purpose providing the occasion for the social connection that was the real content. The meal itself, the pottage, now at its best after a full day of slow cooking, with the morning's bread, and the afternoon's butter, and the ale that Alice drew from the barrel this afternoon. The conversation ranges from the sheep's leg to the haymaking, to the news about the manor court that Eleanor's smithy distributed this afternoon. This news has reached Thomas via the woman at the well, who heard it from the man who had a shoe repaired this afternoon, in approximately 4 hours, which is roughly the speed of sound in a medieval village. The manor court news produces the specific conversation that significant news always produces in a community that has things at stake, the household that has been in dispute with its neighbor about the boundary between their strips, a dispute that has been simmering for 2 years, and that the court session might finally resolve, is now planning its approach with an urgency that the distant date of the court had previously allowed to defer. Thomas has his own matter for the court, a claim on a small piece of common pasture rights that the Lord's Reeve has been contesting, not aggressively but persistently, and that Thomas has been building his argument for since the last session. The planning of the court argument, the assembly of the evidence, the identification of the neighbors who will testify to the custom that supports Thomas's position, the management of the case through the specific procedural forms that the manor court used, was one of the activities that the medieval peasant performed with a legal sophistication that the image of the uneducated villain doesn't suggest. The manor court was a legal institution with legal procedures, and the villagers who used it regularly developed the practical legal competence that regular use of any institution produces. Thomas wasn't a lawyer, but he knew how the court worked, knew what kinds of evidence it recognized and what kinds it didn't, knew which arguments the steward found compelling and which he found evasive, and had been thinking about this case for long enough to have developed a presentation that he believed was sound. This is the legal mind at work in the medieval peasant, and it is one of the consistently under-recognized aspects of medieval common life. After the meal and Walter's departure, the evening takes on the specific character of the medieval household's quiet hours. The fire banked to a lower burn that provides warmth and light without consuming wood at the rate the full fire did. The family gathered around it, the activities of the evening organized around the available light. The mending. Alice is doing the mending that accumulates in every household. The torn hose, the jacket with the split seam, the children's clothing that children treat as a competitive sport in terms of how quickly it can be damaged. The mending is the evening's primary handwork for women. The sewing that requires the better light of the fire rather than the ambient outdoor light that sufficed for spinning. The needle and thread and the piece of clothing in the lap, worked by firelight. This is the image of the medieval evening that the accounts and the illustrations return to consistently, because it was the reality of the evening that most households shared. Thomas is making something. This is the other characteristic of the medieval evening that the modern account misses: the making. The agricultural household of the medieval period produced a significant proportion of its own material goods, and the evenings were the time for this production. The tool handle that needs replacement. Thomas is shaping it from the ash blank he cut last week. The spokeshave, removing thin curls of wood that fall into the rushes while the form of the handle gradually emerges. The basket that needed repairing. The basket work of the harvest was repaired in the evening hours of the weeks before the harvest, when the work could be done in the available light, and the urgency of the harvest hadn't yet arrived. The children are doing what children do in the evening. The older ones engaged in the smaller versions of what the adults are doing. The younger ones fighting the sleep that is coming for them with the specific creative rearguard action of children who don't want to be the first to go to bed. The youngest has been asleep for an hour already, carried to the sleeping space and settled without great ceremony. The medieval household's relationship with putting children to bed was efficient in the way of households that have a lot of children and have stopped negotiating. Robert's evening is organized around people. The steward's household is the natural gathering point for the village's administrative class. The reeve, the bailiff, the more prosperous peasants who have business with the manor. And the evening is the time when this gathering happens informally, over ale and the specific conversation of people who manage a community's affairs and find the management of a community's affairs perpetually interesting. Hugh the Reeve is here this evening, the afternoon's meeting having ended in the amicable way that meetings between Robert and Hugh usually end once both parties have said their piece, with the understanding that each is doing his job, and that the jobs, while sometimes in tension, are both necessary. Hugh has information about the ox situation that he wants Robert to understand before the auditor's visit. The ox belonged to one of the village's most reliable contributors to labor services, and the man has never defaulted before and is not defaulting now. The animal went lame. It will recover. The drainage work will be completed within 2 weeks. Robert understands this. He includes it in his mental note for the auditor. The evening conversation at Robert's table is also partly about the court session. Robert knows what's coming to the court. He has been managing the manor's legal affairs for long enough to have a picture of the outstanding disputes. And the conversation with Hugh allows him to understand the village's perspective on those disputes before the court forces him to adjudicate them. The Lord's Court was not a simple adversarial process in the modern legal sense. It was a negotiation institution, a place where disputes were resolved through the application of custom and the judgment of the community as much as through the authority of the Lord. The steward who understood the community's view of a dispute before the court session was a steward who could guide the court toward an outcome that would hold, rather than an outcome that would generate the next dispute. Robert had learned this through experience, and the evening conversations with Hugh were part of how he maintained the understanding that good judgment required. Margaret, meanwhile, is conducting her own evening diplomacy, the domestic social network of the village, the relationships between women that operated through visiting, through shared work, through the mutual aid that the community's survival depended on, ran through Margaret's household in the same way that the administrative network ran through Robert's. The woman who had come this evening to ask Margaret's advice about her daughter's illness was getting genuine advice from someone who had raised children and knew the village healer and could give an informed opinion about when a cough required professional attention and when it required time. Margaret's social knowledge, the specific detailed awareness of every household's situation that her position and her personality had built over the years, was one of the most valuable assets of the village community, and she used it with the combination of genuine care and practical efficiency of someone who understood that the social network she maintained was not separate from the community's functioning, but was a large part of how it functioned. Eleanor and William's evening is quieter than the others. The forge is cold and the smithy is shut, and the specific relief of a craftsman whose day's work is done, the physical and mental unwinding from the sustained concentration of the forge, produces the specifically peaceful evening that Eleanor thinks of as the day's reward. They eat their supper with their 2 children and William's apprentice, the 14-year-old boy from the next village who has been with them for a year, and who is learning the trade the way all trade knowledge was learned in the period, through the bodily experience of doing it under supervision. The conversation at the smithy's table is about the door hinges and about whether the church will pay the agreed price on time or will be the church about it, which is a phrase that William uses for the specific financial behavior of ecclesiastical clients who seem to believe that their status in the next world exempts them from prompt payment in this one. Eleanor calculates that the hinges will be ready in 2 days and that she will collect the payment herself. Because when Eleanor collects payments, the transactions are completed with an efficiency that suggests the payer has correctly assessed the social cost of the alternative. Chapter 7. The recreation, the games, the stories, and the specific pleasures of the medieval day. This chapter requires a statement up front. Medieval people played. Not apologetically, not rarely, not in the furtive way of people sneaking enjoyment into a life that was supposed to be organized around suffering and toil. They played with the commitment of people who understood that pleasure was a real and valuable part of human life, that the body and the mind needed recreation as genuinely as they needed food, and that the available pleasures, while different in form from the pleasures available to the modern person, were pleasures in the full sense of the word. The evidence for medieval play and recreation is actually abundant, and it comes from sources whose reliability makes it hard to dismiss. The Church's attempts to regulate and restrict certain kinds of recreation, which presuppose that the recreation was happening and was common enough to be worth regulating. The legal records of injuries sustained in recreational activities, which reveal in their clinical specificity what the activities were and how seriously they were pursued. The visual record of the manuscript illustrations, the calendar pages, the marginalia, the illustrations of seasonal activities, which show medieval people playing games, dancing, hunting, feasting, and generally behaving like people who are having a good time. The games were varied and serious. Medieval football, the game played with an inflated bladder between villages or between groups of young men with goals at opposite ends of the village common or the parish boundary, and with rules that were more suggested than enforced, was a regular feature of the village's recreational calendar, particularly on the feast days and holidays that punctuated the working year. Medieval football was not the organized sport of the modern game. It was closer to a controlled riot, with dozens of participants, no fixed team sizes, and a physical intensity that the authorities consistently found alarming and attempted to regulate. The attempts to regulate medieval football are some of the more entertainingly futile exercises of medieval administrative authority. The prohibition of football in various English towns from the 14th century onward, issued on the grounds that it was preventing men from practicing archery, which was a genuine military concern, produced essentially no reduction in the playing of football, because the men who were playing football were playing it because they wanted to play it, and because their neighbors were playing it, and because the feast day had created the occasion and the social pressure that the prohibition couldn't counter. The village green, the common space at the center of many English villages, was the stage for the recreational life of the community. The summer evenings on the green, when the day's work had wound down enough to allow the gathering, were occasions for the dancing, the games, the socializing that the working day didn't permit in quite the same form. The round dances and carol dances of the medieval period, groups of men and women in circles or lines, moving to the music of a pipe, and tabor or a fiddle, were not formal performance dances with trained participants. They were participatory social events, the medieval equivalent of the party, where the point was to be part of the movement and the music together rather than to demonstrate technical skill. The dancing on the green this summer evening is a Thursday, and the dancing happens because it is not a fast day. The weather is pleasant, and the miller's son has been learning the fiddle with an enthusiasm that has outpaced his skill but not his confidence. The sound that reaches the village is recognizably musical in intention, if not always in execution. And the response of the village is the response of people who would rather dance to enthusiastic fiddle than not dance at all, which is the correct response. Thomas is not dancing. Thomas is watching from the bench outside his house with the specific pleasure of the man who has done enough physical labor today that observation is more appealing than participation, and who is drinking the ale that Alice brought him, and feeling the specific rightness of sitting still after moving all day. His participation in the green social life is present and valued even from the bench. The comments he makes, the conversations he joins from a distance, the companionable watching that is its own form of community participation. John is dancing. 14-year-old John has the energy that the day's work hasn't fully consumed, and the social motivation that the presence of a specific girl from the neighboring household creates. The girl in question, the daughter of the man with the drainage dispute, is also dancing in the specific way of someone who is aware of being watched and has views about what the watching implies that are complicated enough to require more data before a conclusion can be reached. The social drama of John and the girl is not invisible to the watching adults, who have the advantage of having been 14 themselves and knowing exactly what it looks like. The games of skill were the other dimension of the evening's recreation. The archery that the young men practiced, not just as military preparation, but as a genuinely competitive recreational activity. The butts set up at the edge of the common for the regular competitions that the village organized was both sport and training, the distinction between them not being one that the medieval mind felt compelled to maintain. The wrestling, the running races, the competitions in throwing heavy stones or wooden billets. These were recreation that was also physical conditioning, play that was also the maintenance of the physical capabilities that the agricultural and military life required. The dice games, the tables, the family of games related to backgammon that were among the most popular indoor games of the medieval period. The card games that arrived in Europe in the late 14th century and spread with a speed that suggested the population had been waiting for them. The chess that was played at every social level, from the aristocracy who treated it as a prestige activity to the village tavern keeper who had a board and pieces for the customers who wanted a game while they drank. The tavern, the alehouse of the medieval village, often operated by one of the village women as an extension of her household brewing, was the evening's social center for those who wanted company and drink without the domestic obligations of the household. The alehouse was not a dedicated building in most villages. It was a household that sold ale, identified by the ale stake or ale branch hanging outside the door on the days when fresh ale was available. But its social function was the same as the tavern in any era, a neutral social space where the community's members could gather outside the hierarchies and obligations of the household and the workplace. The stories were perhaps the most important recreation of the medieval evening and the least visible in the historical record because they were oral rather than written, performed rather than documented. The storytelling that happened around the fire, the tales of saints and heroes and local legend, and the specific comic stories of human foolishness that every community generates about itself and its neighbors, was the medieval equivalent of the evening's entertainment, and it was performed by people who had developed the skills of the oral tradition, the memory for narrative, the voice for performance, the timing that distinguishes the good story from the merely adequate one. The stories that were told were not the polished literary productions of the court poets. Those were another tradition, also important, but separate from the village storytelling that most people actually experienced. The stories of the village evening were the stories that the teller had heard from their parents and their grandparents, that had been in the community for generations, that had accumulated the specific detail and the specific humor that made them recognizable as belonging to this community's tradition. The saints' lives were the religious layer of this storytelling tradition. The stories of the patron saint of the parish, of the local saints, whose shrines were within walking distance, of the miraculous cures and dramatic conversions and improbable survivals that the hagiographic tradition had generated, and that the community retold in its own register, with the specific combination of genuine devotion and narrative embellishment that oral tradition produces. The miracle story that everyone in the village knew, the one about the man who was healed at the shrine 3 generations ago, whose details had been shaped by 100 retellings into the perfect proportions of a good story, was not simply pious repetition. It was the community's self-understanding, the story of who they were and what they believed, told in the way that stories embed belief more effectively than doctrine. The humor. Medieval humor requires its own moment because the popular perception of the Middle Ages as a period of unrelenting solemnity is one of the more tenacious historical myths, and the evidence against it is substantial. The fabliaux, the comic tales of the medieval French and English tradition, many of which survive in the collections that Chaucer drew on for the Canterbury Tales, are not polite literature. They are robust, physical, frequently obscene comic stories about human foolishness, domestic comedy, the gap between pretension and reality, the specific humor of people who find the pompous and the hypocritical genuinely funny and are not inhibited in expressing this. The story of the priest who thinks he's conducting an affair in secret while everyone in the village knows exactly what's happening. The story of the merchant who is too clever and outsmarts himself into disaster. The story of the wife who manages her difficult husband with a combination of patience and cunning that the audience is invited to admire. These stories were not considered low or disreputable by the people who told and heard them. They were part of the full range of human comic expression, told with the same enjoyment that any good story produces, and they were told in the village as well as at the court, in the alehouse as well as in the great hall, because the comic instinct that finds human pretension funny is not a class-specific capacity. William the blacksmith, it emerges, is a good storyteller. He has the blacksmith's social position at the center of the village's network of relationships. Everyone comes to the smithy, which means William knows everyone's business, and the storytelling instinct that turns this knowledge into material. The story he tells this evening to the small group gathered around the smithy's cooling forge concerns the bailiff and a pig that escaped the pound last autumn in circumstances that reflect poorly on the bailiff's organizational capacity, and that William narrates with the comedian's perfect timing and the straight face of someone who has never in his life found this story funny and intends to keep not finding it funny until everyone around him has stopped laughing. Chapter 8. The Disruptions, the day that didn't go as planned, and how the medieval world handled it. The ordinary day was regularly interrupted by the extraordinary, not extraordinary in the dramatic, historically significant sense, not the arrival of the plague or the passage of an army, but extraordinary in the sense of the unexpected, the thing that wasn't supposed to happen and happened anyway, and that required the medieval person to do something that wasn't on the day's plan. The management of the disrupted day was one of the most revealing aspects of medieval life, because it showed the community's actual capacities rather than the theoretical ones. This particular Tuesday, our day, the summer day we've been following, has a disruption at approximately 4 in the afternoon, when the drainage ditch in the north field gives way. Not dramatically, it's not a flood, but the poorly maintained section of the ditch that Hugh has been discussing with Robert all week has finally let go at a weak point, and the water that the ditch was supposed to channel away from the strip fields is now moving across the south end of the north field in a way that, if not addressed before evening, will damage the crops of 3 separate strips belonging to 3 separate households. The news travels through the village in the way that urgent practical news always traveled in medieval communities, fast, by word of mouth, reaching the relevant parties within an hour. The 3 households whose strips are threatened are those of Thomas, a man named Geoffrey, and the widow Agnes, who holds half a vergate from the Lord, and who has been managing it since her husband died 4 years ago without any reduction in its productive output. The response to the news is the medieval community's mutual aid system in its most direct form. Thomas, informed by the boy running through the village that the ditch has let go, puts down the fence repair and walks to the north field to assess the situation. Geoffrey is already there. Agnes's son is there with her tools. 2 other men who have no strips in the affected area, but who are the kind of people who respond to a practical emergency by going to it, are there. The repair of the ditch is not technically complex. It is hard physical work: digging, moving earth, rebuilding the failed section, redirecting the water back into the working channel. It takes 2 hours of sustained labor from 5 people working together, organized by the informal competence hierarchy that the situation creates. Geoffrey knows this particular ditch better than anyone because his strip is the one most immediately threatened. So Geoffrey leads the repair work without anyone needing to appoint him to the role. The cooperation is unremarkable in the sense that it is expected. This is what the village does when a practical emergency affects the community's agricultural interests, and remarkable in the sense that it happens without payment, without formal obligation, and without any individual calculating the exchange value of their contribution. The understanding that the village's agricultural infrastructure was a shared resource that required collective maintenance was so thoroughly embedded in the community's self-understanding that the calculation of individual benefit and cost didn't intrude on the decision to help. The man who helped with the ditch today had his own ditch repaired by the community 2 years ago, after the spring floods. He will have something that needs the community's attention in the future. The accounting of these exchanges was real, but it was kept in the social ledger of the community's collective memory, rather than in any individual's tally of debts and credits. This is the informal insurance system of the medieval village, running on social trust rather than financial instruments, and it worked with an efficiency that the formal systems struggled to match. Agnes, whose son is doing the digging, is doing something else. Agnes is managing the conversation between Thomas and Geoffrey, who have the drainage dispute we mentioned this morning. The dispute about whose responsibility the ditch maintenance is, which is now no longer a theoretical question, but a very practical one with a 2-hour timeline. The conversation between Thomas and Geoffrey as they dig is the conversation of 2 people who have a genuine legal disagreement and who are currently setting it aside in order to deal with the immediate problem, and who are both aware that setting it aside doesn't resolve it, and that the court session is now going to include this incident in the account of the dispute. Agnes's mediation is skillful in the way of someone who has been navigating the social dynamics of the village for 40 years, and who understands that the conversation happening over the ditch repair is setting the terms for the conversation that will happen in the court, and that the terms being set now are more favorable to both parties than the adversarial version the court would otherwise produce. By the time the ditch is repaired, Thomas and Geoffrey have not resolved the underlying dispute. That will go to the court, but they have reached an understanding about the immediate situation that prevents the ditch repair from generating the additional grievance that it could have. This is the medieval dispute resolution system at its informal level. the level below the manor court, where most disputes were actually resolved before they reached the formal institution. The village's capacity to manage its own conflicts, through the social intelligence of people like Agnes, through the pressure of community opinion, through the informal negotiation that happened in the field and at the well and around the forge, was the first line of the legal system, and it was often more effective than the formal institutions that backed it. The other disruption of this particular day is medical. The blacksmith's apprentice has burned his hand. This is not surprising. Burns are one of the routine occupational hazards of smithy work, but this particular burn is serious enough that Eleanor, assessing it with the practical medical knowledge that the village healer has shared with her over years of being the person who deals with the smithy's injuries, determines that it needs professional attention rather than the household remedy she would apply to a minor burn. The village healer, a woman named Maud, whose medical practice combines the empirical knowledge of a lifetime of treating the village's injuries and illnesses with the herbal knowledge of the local plant tradition, and a selection of remedies from the written medical tradition that her priest has explained to her over the years, is at the third house on the East Lane, and Eleanor is there within 15 minutes. Maud's treatment of the burned hand is the medieval healing tradition at its practical best. The specific herbs and preparations that the evidence suggests actually have beneficial effects on burns. The honey that was applied to many medieval wounds, and that modern medicine has confirmed, has genuine antimicrobial properties. The specific cooling preparations, the dressing that protected the wound from the contamination that would make it worse. Maud doesn't know about bacteria. She knows that certain preparations make burns heal better than others because she has treated burns for 30 years and has observed the outcomes with the attentiveness of a practitioner whose reputation depends on results. The burned hand will heal. The apprentice will be back at the forge in a week with the specific caution about that particular operation that getting burned once produces in a way that no amount of prior instruction quite manages. The medical disruption was a regular feature of the medieval day, and the community's capacity to respond to it was more sophisticated than the popular image of medieval medicine allows. Maud was not a university-trained physician. She was a healer in the empirical tradition, whose knowledge was accumulated through experience rather than through the formal medical education that the university-trained physician had. But her knowledge was genuine, her results were real, and her position in the village's medical ecosystem, the first resort for the ordinary injuries and illnesses of daily life, the person who knew when a case was beyond her and needed to go to the physician in the market town, was appropriate and effective. Chapter 9. The Night. What happened when the light finally went? The sun is setting, not in the tentative, apologetic way of the winter sun that barely rises before it starts declining. The summer sunset is a long, gradual affair, the light lasting well past 9 in the evening. The sky holding its pale luminescence for an hour after the sun has actually dropped below the horizon, the full dark not arriving until nearly 10. The medieval summer day was genuinely long, and the people who had started their work before 5 in the morning had been operating for 17 hours by the time the dark became complete, which is either impressive or exhausting, depending on whether you are reading about it or living it. The transition from light to dark was managed with the specific practical intelligence that medieval people applied to all the day's transitions. The shutters that had been open all day were now closed, not all at once, but progressively, as the light in each room dropped below the threshold for the work being done there. The fire that had been banked low through the afternoon was built up again for the evening, providing both warmth and light, the specific warm orange of firelight being the primary illumination of the medieval interior after dark. The candles were lit. The candle of the medieval household was not the decorative, aromatic, wellness-adjacent object of the modern imagination. It was a practical light source that cost money. Tallow candles, the affordable option made from rendered animal fat, cost less than beeswax candles, but still represented a real expenditure that the household managed carefully. The decision about how many candles to burn on a given evening was a genuine economic calculation. the work that needed to be done, the light required to do it, balanced against the cost of the candles consumed. Tallow candles had a specific smell when burning, the smell of rendered animal fat combusting, which is distinctive and not universally appreciated, but which is the smell of the medieval evening indoors, a present in every household that wasn't wealthy enough for beeswax. The wealthier household burned beeswax, which burned cleaner and brighter and without the tallow smell and the quality of light to easy eye. Household could command after dark was another of the period's reliable social indicators. Thomas's household is using one candle and the firelight. One candle is sufficient for the work of the evening, the mending, the tool making, the conversation, because medieval people had adapted to low light conditions in ways that the modern person who lives in permanent artificial daylight has not. The dark adapted eye that has not spent the day staring at a bright screen can read and do fine work by candlelight and firelight with a facility that modern people find surprising when they try it. The accommodation is real and relatively quick, and the medieval person who spent their evenings in candlelight had better low-light vision than their modern equivalent simply through regular practice. The children are going to bed, not with the dramatic negotiations of the modern household. The requests for water, the philosophical inquiries about the nature of death, the sudden urgent need for a conversation about something that definitely could have been mentioned at any point during the day, but which somehow only becomes pressing at bedtime. But with the efficient settlement of a household that has a clear bedtime, enforced by parents who have been awake since before dawn, and who find their patience for extension requests limited by the arithmetic of the day's hours. The youngest has been asleep for 2 hours already. The middle children are settled without significant ceremony. John, the 14-year-old, is given a slightly later latitude that reflects his age and the work he did today, and he uses this latitude to sit near the fire, thinking about the girl from the green in the specific, comprehensive, slightly obsessive way of 14-year-olds thinking about a person for the first time, and finding that the thinking has a momentum that the subject's actual presence doesn't entirely explain. Thomas and Alice's evening, once the children are settled, takes on the specific character of the time that belongs to them rather than to the household's requirements. The conversation between them, the conversation that is different from the working conversation about the strips and the children and the manor court, different from the social conversation with Walter and the neighbors, is the conversation of two people who have been working in parallel all day and are now briefly in the same register. The specific content of this conversation is private in the sense that no record of it survives, because no record was kept. The intimate conversations of medieval peasant couples were not the subject of contemporary documentation, and the historian who wants to know what Thomas and Alice talked about in the evenings is working entirely from inference and from the occasional window that personal letters and court testimony provide into the emotional texture of medieval marriage. What the evidence suggests is that medieval marriages, particularly at the level of the prosperous peasant household, were relationships of genuine partnership, economic, social, and emotional, and that the marriages that worked, that produced the functional households, and raised the surviving children, and managed the strips, and the dairy, and the ale, and the court cases, worked because the two people in them were genuinely collaborative, not always harmoniously. The court records of the period contain plenty of evidence of marital conflict and its resolution through formal and informal means, but with the specific accumulated knowledge of two people who have been running a complex operation together for many years, and who know each other's minds and capacities and limitations with the intimacy that only sustained partnership produces. Thomas and Alice talk about John and the girl from the neighboring household, and what they think about the prospect this represents. They talk about the court case and whether Thomas's argument is strong enough, and Alice has a specific suggestion about who should testify that Thomas hadn't considered, and that is, on reflection, a better choice than the witness he had planned. They talk about the youngest child's cough, which Alice has been watching for the signs that would require Maud's attention, and their assessment of the current situation is that it's improving. The second sleep. The medieval night was organized, as we have established in previous scripts, around the two-sleep pattern: the first sleep, the waking interval, the second sleep, and the waking interval of Thomas and Alice's. Night falls somewhere around midnight, a period of perhaps an hour, in which they are both awake in the dark, the fire reduced to coals, the house quiet around them. This interval was used for prayer. The church's framework prescribed it as the appropriate time for the night office, the prayer that the canonical hours specified for the dark hours, and for the conversation and the intimacy that the interval provided, and that the structured day didn't always permit in the same quality. The accounts of the waking interval that survive in diaries and letters describe it as a valued time, the middle of the night having a specific quality of stillness and permission to think, to talk, to be with another person without the demand of the working day's agenda that the day's hours didn't quite provide. The fire is checked, a log is added, the coals that have been banking through the first sleep are uncovered and encouraged, the specific orange glow confirming that the fire has held and will hold through the second sleep's hours. Thomas lies back, Alice lies back. The house is warm enough, quiet enough, dark enough. The second sleep comes quickly, as it typically does for people who have been up since before dawn and who have given the day everything the day demanded. Robert's night is later than Thomas's. The letter has been finished, sealed, and given to the man who will take it to the Lord's household tomorrow. The meeting with Hugh is done. The wax tablet notes for the auditor's visit have been organized into the preliminary order that Robert will refine tomorrow. Margaret has settled the household, the servants in their sleeping spaces, the children in their room, the house secured for the night, with the specific domestic management of someone who does this so automatically that the doing is below consciousness. Robert and Margaret's quiet time is the time that Robert's anxiety most reliably surfaces, because the daytime's activity keeps it at a manageable distance, and the night's quiet removes the distance. The 17 bushels are resolved, but the auditor will still arrive next week, with the particular appetite for discrepancy that auditors bring to their work. And the drainage delay, and the millstone, and the labor service uncertainty are all items that a thorough auditor might wish to discuss in terms that Robert would find uncomfortable. Margaret's response to this anxiety is the response of someone who has been managing Robert's anxiety about auditors for 15 years, and who has developed a calibrated approach. She acknowledges the concern. She reminds him of the specific reasons why each item has a satisfactory explanation, and she reminds him that the Lord's confidence in his stewardship is based on 15 years of competent management, that a single audit question is not going to displace. This is not false reassurance. It is the accurate assessment of someone who has observed the situation long enough to have a realistic view of it, and Robert knows it is accurate, and the knowing helps more than the saying, but the saying helps too. William and Eleanor have been asleep since 10. The smithy's early start, even earlier than the agricultural day, meaning that the late evening is not available to them in the way it is to Robert and Margaret. The SEO apprentice's burned hand has been dressed, and the apprentice is sleeping. The forge's fire is cold. The forge fire was not banked the way the household fire was banked, because starting the forge from cold was a different and more manageable process than starting the household fire, and the coal management of the forge was separate from the coal management of the house. Eleanor's last thought before sleep is about the church hinge payment, and whether she should go to the priest on Thursday or wait until William delivers the finished pieces, and whether waiting gives the priest the opportunity to raise the question of whether one of the decorative elements could be slightly different from what was agreed, which is a conversation Eleanor has had with this particular priest before, and would prefer not to have again. She decides on Thursday. She sleeps. Chapter 10. The Church's Day. How faith structured everything from sunrise to the second sleep. The medieval day was not secular. This requires saying clearly, because the modern habit of separating the religious from the practical, of treating faith as a personal private matter that occupies specific times and spaces and otherwise doesn't interfere with the working day, is so thoroughly embedded in the modern experience that it's almost impossible to imagine a world organized differently. But the medieval world was organized differently, and understanding how faith structured the medieval day is essential to understanding what medieval people actually did all day, because faith was not something they added to the day. It was the framework within which the day happened. The canonical hours we have already mentioned as time markers, the church bells ringing through the day at the intervals prescribed by the liturgical schedule, were not just time markers. They were calls to prayer, and the response to them was prayer. The paternoster said at each bell, the brief pause in the work to acknowledge the hour and its spiritual significance, the momentary reorientation of attention from the task to the divine that the hour required. This didn't stop the work. It interrupted it briefly, and the work resumed. But the interruption was real and repeated 7 times through the day, and the cumulative effect of these interruptions was a day organized around a rhythm of attention that was simultaneously practical and devotional. The church attendance that the week required was Sunday Mass, which was not optional for anyone in the medieval community below the level of serious illness. Sunday Mass was the week's primary communal event, the one moment when the entire community was assembled in the same space for the same purpose. And it was the occasion for the community's social, political, and economic life, as much as its religious life. The announcements and the disputes and the information that the community needed to share being organized around the Sunday Mass. Because Sunday Mass was when everyone was there. Thomas at Sunday Mass is a different Thomas from Thomas in the hayfield. The church is the one space in the village where the social hierarchy is simultaneously displayed and transcended. The Lord and his family in the chancel, the prosperous peasants in the front of the nave, the ordinary villagers behind, the poor at the back, but also the one space where the theological insistence on the equality of souls before God created a counter-narrative to the social hierarchy that the seating arrangement expressed. The priest who preached the equality of souls to a congregation whose seating arrangement embodied the inequality of bodies was not preaching a radical message. It was the standard theological position. But the tension between the message and the seating was one that the medieval congregation lived with and thought about more than the modern account of medieval religious passivity suggests. The sermons, medieval sermons have a reputation for being long, incomprehensible, and delivered in Latin to a congregation that didn't speak Latin, which would have made them simultaneously mystifying and soporific. This reputation is partly deserved and partly a caricature. The Latin Mass was indeed in Latin, and the majority of the congregation didn't speak Latin, and the formal liturgy of the Mass was experienced by most of the congregation as a sacred performance whose meaning was partially understood through the visual and physical elements: the altar, the vestments, the gestures, the incense, the bells, rather than through the comprehension of every word. But the sermon was typically in the vernacular, in the language the congregation actually spoke. And the medieval sermon tradition was a sophisticated oral form that the best preachers used with real skill. The exemplum, the illustrative story embedded in the sermon to make the theological point concrete, was one of the great storytelling forms of the medieval period, and the congregation that heard a good preacher work a well-chosen exemplum was not a congregation sitting through incomprehensible Latin. It was a congregation engaged by a skilled narrator working with material that touched the actual texture of their daily life. The feasts of the saints' calendar were the other dimension of the church's organization of the medieval day, and their frequency surprises people who haven't looked at the medieval liturgical calendar closely. There were approximately 40 to 50 feast days per year in the standard medieval calendar, varying by region and the specific saints honored in each diocese, and these feast days were holidays. Not just religious observances, but actual rest days, days when the work stopped and the community gathered for the combination of religious celebration and social festivity that the medieval feast day provided. The calculation of how many working days per year the medieval peasant actually had, the annual total minus the Sundays, minus the feast days, minus the weather days when outdoor work was impossible, minus the sick days that illness and injury produces a number that is significantly less than the 365-day slog that the image of medieval peasant life implies. The medieval working year was approximately 250 days, which is less than the modern full-time worker's approximately 250 working days, though the intensity of the medieval working day's physical labor makes a direct comparison complicated. The saints were the medieval day's supernatural companions, and their presence in the daily life was practical as well as theological. Each craft had its patron saint. Saint Eloi for the blacksmiths, Saint Crispin for the shoemakers, Saint Homobonus for the merchants, the specific saint whose intercession was relevant to the specific work being done. William's workshop contained a small image of Saint Eloi, patron of metalworkers and smiths. That was not merely decorative. It was the focus of the brief prayer before the forge was lit, the acknowledgement of the divine involvement in the craft that the Christian framework of the period made natural, and that the pragmatic blacksmith found entirely compatible with the practical management of iron and coal. The prayers for specific needs, the prayer for a good harvest, the prayer for a sick child, the prayer for the court case to go well, the prayer for the lost tool to be found, the prayer for the weather to hold through the haymaking, were a continuous accompaniment to the day's events, said by people who genuinely believed in their efficacy. The modern distinction between doing something practical about a problem and praying about it was not a distinction that the medieval mind made. Both were practical responses to the problem, operating through different mechanisms, but equally real in their efficacy as the medieval person understood it. The local shrine was the intensified version of this prayer practice, the pilgrimage to the nearby shrine of a local saint, the candle lit, the specific request made in the presence of the saint's image or relics, the offering left as the evidence of the petition. Pilgrimage to local shrines was not the exotic long-distance journey to Canterbury or Rome that the literary tradition emphasizes. It was the ordinary practice of the village community, the regular visit to the shrine 2 or 3 miles away, that the feast day provided the occasion for, the practical theological consultation with the saint whose specialty matched the problem. Maud, the healer's relationship with the shrine of St. Bartholomew, the saint of the neighboring village's church, whose specialty in the local tradition included eye ailments and certain fevers, was both devotional and professional. The cases that Maud referred to St. Bartholomew's shrine were cases that her empirical medicine had done its best with, and that needed the supplement of divine intervention, and the cases that improved after the shrine visit confirmed Maud's theological framework in exactly the way that the cases that improved after her own treatments confirmed her medical framework. The evidence of outcomes was incorporated into the existing understanding without necessarily requiring a revision of the theory. The confessor, the priest to whom the medieval person confessed their sins in the sacrament of penance, was also one of the village's primary counselors in the modern sense, the person to whom personal problems were brought in the framework of the confessional that provided both the theological context and the social permission for the disclosure of difficulties that the ordinary social framework might not easily accommodate. The priest who heard Thomas's confession about the anger he felt toward the Lord's Reeve about the labor service question was hearing something that was simultaneously a theological matter. There's the sin of anger, and a social political matter about the village's working relationships, and the absolution and the penance he assigned addressed both dimensions without distinguishing sharply between them. The church's calendar organized not just the week and the year but the life. The baptism that integrated the new person into the community and the divine order. The confirmation that ratified their membership. The marriage that constituted a new household. The last rites that prepared the soul for its final transition. These were not merely social ceremonies with religious decoration. They were the events through which the medieval person understood their own life as having a theological shape, a movement from birth to death that was simultaneously a natural process and a spiritual journey, the ordinary human life embedded in a cosmic narrative that gave it meaning beyond its own duration. Chapter 11. The Feast Day, the day that wasn't ordinary, and why it mattered. Today is not our Tuesday. Today is the feast of St. John the Baptist, the 24th of June, and everything is different. The Feast of St. John was one of the great summer festivals of the medieval calendar, the celebration of the summer solstice, wrapped in Christian form, the holiday that marked the height of the year with fire and dancing, and the specific exuberance of a community that has come through the cold months and the hungry spring, and is now in the full abundance of summer, with the harvest ahead and the long, warm evenings, and the sense that the year has reached the moment of its fullest possibility. Nobody is in the fields this morning. The work stops for the feast day. Not just the Lord's labor services, but the household's own work, the strips and the dairy, and the spinning and the fence repair, all of it pausing for the 24 hours of the feast. This is not a minor concession. In the agricultural calendar, where the timing of every task is calibrated to the season and the weather, a full day of non-work during the summer busy season is a real cost. And it is one that the community accepts willingly because the feast day is not experienced as lost productivity, but as a necessary, valued, genuinely joyful interruption of the working year. The preparations for the feast began yesterday. Alice has been cooking. The feast day food is different from the daily pottage, in the same way that a party's food is different from a Tuesday dinner, which is to say that more time was spent on it, better ingredients were used, and the result is something that the people eating it recognize as belonging to a special category of experience. The ale has been specially brewed, stronger than the table ale of the ordinary day. The bread is a finer flour. The meat, if the household has it, and today they do, the small joint that Alice has been saving for exactly this occasion, is roasted rather than boiled. The community gathers in, a way it doesn't on ordinary days. The gathering happens at the church first, the morning mass of the feast day, attended by the entire village with a thoroughness that the Sunday mass nearly achieves, because the feast day carries a social obligation to participate that the ordinary Sunday slightly dilutes through familiarity. The church on the feast day of a major saint is a church that smells of the flowers and herbs that the village has brought to decorate it. The midsummer flowers of the hedgerows, the green branches that have been cut from the village's trees, the specific fragrant herbs that tradition prescribed for this particular feast. The churchyard after Mass is the first gathering place, and the churchyard's social life on a feast day morning was one of the most vivid scenes in the medieval village calendar. The conversations that couldn't happen in the church, the greetings, the catching up, the news exchange, the introduction of the young man to the family of the young woman whose acquaintance at the Green last week had produced consequences that required parental involvement. All of this happened in the churchyard, the sacred space becoming the social space in a transition that the medieval community made without self-consciousness. The midsummer bonfire is being built on the green. The bonfire of the Feast of St. John was one of the most widespread and consistent features of medieval midsummer celebration across Europe. And it was old enough. The traces of pre-Christian midsummer fire traditions underneath the Christian feast were visible enough to the church's authorities that it generated a regular stream of clerical commentary, ranging from toleration to mild concern to occasional outright condemnation. The condemnations didn't stop the bonfires, because the bonfires were sufficiently embedded in the community's festive tradition that they were experienced as essential to the feast rather than as optional additions to it. The bonfire served multiple purposes simultaneously. The practical, the fire was lit at dusk, and the leaping over the fire, the specific act of jumping through the flames or across the embers that was the bonfire's central participatory element, was believed to protect against illness, to promote fertility, to ward off the evil that the midsummer tradition associated with the days around the solstice. The social, the bonfire, was the community's gathering point through the evening, the shared light around which everyone assembled, the occasion for the dancing and the music, and the courtship and the games that the feast day sanctioned. Thomas jumps the bonfire. He does this every year, with the specific mixture of genuine belief in its protective efficacy and the performer's awareness that the jump is also a statement of health, of capacity, of continued membership in the community of people who still jump rather than stand at the edge and watch. At 38, his jump is not the spectacular leap of a 20-year-old, but it is a real jump, and it clears the embers, and he lands on the other side, and the people around him make the sounds of approval that the successful jump produces. And this small transaction of performance and recognition is one of the day's pleasures. John also jumps with the specific desperate commitment of someone who is aware that the girl from the green is watching, and for whom the jump has therefore taken on a significance that its practical protective efficacy doesn't quite account for. The girl from the green watches with the careful attention of someone who is assessing a jump and deciding what, if anything, it means. Her mother, standing beside her, watches with the more comprehensive attention of someone who is assessing not just the jump, but the jumper and the jumper's family and the jumper's prospects, and whether the interest that has been developing over the past 2 weeks is the kind of interest that deserves to be encouraged. The dancing follows the bonfire, and the dancing on the feast day is different from the dancing of the ordinary evening on the green. It is more organized, more communal. The dances that everyone knows being performed by everyone together, rather than the informal round dances of the weeknight. The pipe and tabor that provided the green's weeknight music are joined today by a fiddler from the next village who has a reputation for knowing the feast dances, and the resulting music is louder and more reliable than the miller's son's Thursday efforts, though the miller's son is also present and playing alongside with the specific enthusiasm of someone who understands that this is a masterclass and intends to get as much out of it as possible. Robert and Margaret are at the feast, and Robert is not thinking about the auditor. This is worth noting because it is the specific mercy of the feast day, the formal permission to stop thinking about the thing you have been thinking about all week, granted by the communal character of the celebration that makes individual preoccupation seem both antisocial and inappropriate. The feast day was a collective experience in a way that the ordinary day was not, and its collective character was precisely its therapeutic value. The individual's anxieties were temporarily subsumed in the community's shared celebration in a way that didn't resolve the anxieties, but allowed the person carrying them to put them down for a day. Robert eats the feast food and drinks the feast ale, and talks to people he doesn't usually have time to talk to, and watches John jump the bonfire with the assessing eye of a man who is also the father of a daughter of approximately the same age, and who finds the overall situation of the village's young people simultaneously amusing and relevant to his own concerns. Eleanor has organized a feast day contribution that is partly social and partly a well-calculated extension of the Smithies community presence. She has brought a batch of small iron charms, the simple protective tokens that the Feast of St. John traditionally involved, that William made last week from the scrap iron that accumulates in any active forge. The charms are not expensive to produce, and they are not sold. They are given, distributed to the neighbors and the children of the neighborhood, with the generosity that the feast day licensed, and that the community noticed and appreciated, and that was, in Eleanor's thoroughly unsentimental assessment, worth considerably more in goodwill than the value of the scrap iron it required. The feast day ended, not at a fixed hour, but gradually. The bonfire burning down, the dancing slowing, the families with young children peeling away as the night deepened, the young men and women lingering near the dying fire, in the specific way of young men and women who are not yet ready for the evening to end, and who are aware, with the particular awareness of midsummer, that the long light is over and the days are getting shorter now, and that the summer, which has felt like a permanent condition, is already beginning its slow withdrawal. John walks home alongside the girl from the green. This is not accidental. They have managed it with the careful indirection of two people who both wanted it and both needed to arrange it in a way that allowed the arrangement to be attributed to coincidence rather than intention, a social skill that is apparently fully developed by the age of 14. Her name is Marjorie. They talk about the dancing and the bonfire and several other topics whose actual content is secondary to the fact of the conversation, which is the point. Conclusion: the Tuesday is over. The feast day is over. The ordinary and the extraordinary have both happened, and the village of our medieval day has moved through both. With the specific competence of people who understand their world, well enough to navigate it. What did medieval people actually do all day? They worked hard, continuously, from before dawn to after dusk on the ordinary days, with the specific physical engagement of people whose work was directly connected to their survival in ways that most modern work is not. The haymaking and the fence repair, and the brewing and the spinning and the mending and the smithy work, and the letter drafting were not abstract contributions to an economic system whose outputs were remote from daily life. They were the direct production of the food and the warmth and the shelter and the tools and the administration that the community needed to exist, and the people doing them knew exactly what they were for. They thought. Medieval people thought about their work, about their relationships, about their legal positions, about their children's futures, about the theological questions that their faith presented them with, about the practical problems that the day produced and the day's conversation circulated. The manor court argument that Thomas was preparing, the letter that Robert was drafting, the hinge design that William was working through, Eleanor's management of the Smithy's social network. These were all thinking, problem-solving, planning, the application of intelligence to the specific challenges of a life being actively managed rather than passively experienced. They talked. The conversation of the medieval village was its primary information technology, its news network, its social bonding mechanism, its entertainment, its dispute resolution system, and its knowledge transmission channel, and it ran continuously from the first light conversation in the hayfield to the last embers of the feast day's bonfire, carrying the community's shared knowledge and its private gossip and its permanent argument about the drainage ditch with equal energy and slightly different emotional investment. They played. The games and the dancing, and the stories, and the bonfire, and the jokes were not frivolous additions to the serious business of survival. They were the community's proof that it was more than the sum of its survival mechanisms, that the human life contains a dimension that the caloric accounting doesn't capture, that the feast days leap over the fire and the Thursday dance on the green, and William's story about the bailiff and the pig were as genuinely necessary as the haymaking and the letter drafting. They loved and worried and argued and forgave and held grudges and changed their minds and made mistakes and fixed them and made different mistakes and fixed those too in the continuous, complicated, fully human texture of lives that were shaped by conditions very different from our own, but animated by the same fundamental capacities and needs that shape the lives of every human being in every period of history that has left us enough evidence to see it. The mistake is to look at the medieval day and see primarily what it lacked: the technology, the comfort, the information, the options, the freedom from the constraints of the manorial system, and the liturgical calendar, and the open field agriculture, and the tallow candles. All of those absences were real and consequential, and the life they shaped was harder in measurable ways than the life that technological and social development has made available to the people reading this. But the people living that life were not living in the absence of the things they didn't have. They were living in the presence of the things they did: the community, the craft, the faith, the land, the specific daily pleasures of work well done, and food well made, and company well kept, and a bonfire jumped successfully on a midsummer evening with the whole village watching. Thomas is asleep. Alice is asleep. The fire is banked. The children are settled. The strips are doing what strips do in the dark, which is growing quietly toward the harvest that the whole summer's work has been preparing for. The Tuesday is over. Tomorrow there will be a Wednesday with its own work and its own conversation and its own small disruptions and its own pleasures, organized around the same light and the same land and the same community that has been managing this particular piece of the English world for generations and intends to go on managing it for generations more. The church bell rings for Compline, the last prayer of the day. The village sleeps.